All right. So the next thing I want to talk about is the importance of reasoning when it comes to this discussion of critical thinking. So when we think of critical thinking, part of what we're talking about here is our ability to apply our faculty of reason um, to um, to whatever material we're dealing with, right? And we're going to be focusing on argumentation towards the beginning, but as we sort of develop this sort of rational capacity, I think has a much broader importance. So, what does it mean, right, to be rational, right? How do we talk about rationality? And this sort of concept of rationality really became developed in the Western world in ancient Greece with people like Socrates and Plato and particularly Aristotle. Right? Aristotle began to, in sort of a scientific way, develop a theory of reason, and um, he sort of sorted out various forms of argumentation and cataloged those. And so that's sort of the beginning of kind of looking at reason in sort of a scientific way, and that became very important for the Middle Ages as the scholastic and medieval philosophers really sort of honed what Aristotle started, um, and so. And so that's where we really see this. And for Aristotle, what it meant to be a human being, right, was to be rational, right, to be thinking in a certain sort of way, right. He said that, he sort of divided, the plants were living, animals had perception, right, and clearly humans both were living and had perception, but humans had this additional element, which was reasoning, right? We were rational animals. That's how Aristotle defined human beings. Now we can obviously take issue with this definition, from both directions. One, are humans like essentially rational, right? Is that the sort of the essential element of being a human being? And I think there's a lot of evidence to question that. And also we can take issue with that on the other end and say, well, is it only human beings that are rational, right? Is being rational a sufficient reason for being human? And I think that we can also say that is not necessarily the case. But we do, in the history of philosophy, we began pretty early on to have a very strong focus on reason. Now, Aristotle did look at all sort of the other capacities. He looked at rhetoric. He looked at a lot of different sort of elements of persuasion, but this reasoning capacity became very important for Aristotle. So moving to slide 11, we want to think, right, about what the role, or what does it mean, right, to be thinking in not just our rational, faculty. And I should point out, right, the sort of faculty talk, right, is problematic as well, right? We sort of have these various, sort of capacities or faculties that we apply, and I think it's pretty clear that that's not how the mind actually works. But that's, one of the assumptions that we begin in ancient philosophy and becomes even more developed in early modern philosophy. But if we think about the role of thinking in conjunction with other areas of our lives, right? Our emotions, right? What is the role of thinking as emotional beings, right? Are emotions just these sort of passive things, these sort of things that sort of wash over us, right? Or is there sort of a thinking element to them where we use our emotions to engage with the world in a certain sort of way? Um, these emotions have served us in good ways and bad ways for a long time. And is there a way to understand emotions where we can use our thinking to develop them in a better sort of way? What about thinking in the imagination, right? And thinking in creative work. Um, if you want to think about something that's very human, right? Think of storytelling, right? Think of art. think of all these sorts of things that are very human. And I think a lot of people would say, well, those aren't sort of essentially rational um, areas of our lives, right? We don't sort of use reason in our imagination or in our creative work, right? In some ways, those are counter to our rational side, but they're certainly thinking, right? We certainly employ the thinking mind to those areas of our lives, and so what is the role of thinking, in that part of our lives? And then finally, I think it's important to recognize the relationship between reason, thinking, and the will, or to our freedom, right? Because in some ways, right, we want to think about freedom as the ability to sort of either follow what seems to be a rational path, um, or run counter to what seems to be a rational path. And if we can't run counter to what seems to be sort of the rational, sensible way of acting, do we have freedom? And so, what's the relationship between thinking and freedom? And what about those sort of situations where we have two apparently rational or more apparently rational paths that we can take, and the decision making process that goes on there, right? Is that a purely rational sort of decision making process, or is there something else, right? A sort of valuation of the world that is necessary in making those decisions. And I think that brings us to another area of thinking that we need to talk about, and that's the role of thinking when it comes to moral decision making. We're not going to talk a lot about ethics and moral decision making in this class, at least not until probably the last week. But we need to consider what the importance is of thinking in moral decision making, right? And is that tied to what we would normally call rational thinking? We're going to struggle sort of bringing sort of moral questions into the sort of formal logical framework we're going to be developing over the next week or two. And so, but those sort of moral questions are central to who we are, right? And we consider those moral questions, right? Those are the things we dwell on, often in our lives. And so, how do we bring the rational mind to sort of bear on those moral questions? And we'll talk a bit about that much later in the course. Okay, moving to slide 12. This class sort of assumes that thinking is something that we can get better at. And so, do we think of thinking, and we talk about critical thinking, right? That's the sort of capacity of us to sort of develop a type of mind that we can, apply to the world. Is that something that we can get better at, right? Or is thinking something that's just innate, right? Sort of our rational capacity is just sort of thing that's innate, and we can't develop it. Now, clearly, I'm going to say that it's something that we can get better at. And again, this goes back to Aristotle, who, when Aristotle looked at the virtues, he looked at not just sort of moral virtues that we need to consider, but he also looked at thinking virtues, right? Virtues of thought. And the reason he sort of looked to these is because he said that, well, we can sort of hone our thinking mind, right? We are rational beings. We have the capacity for reason, but that capacity for reason can develop in a much more sort of thorough way, right? And we can get better at it over time, right? Prudence, common sense. We recognize this, right? We recognize that we can sort of develop our reasoning, through practice. And this class is going to give you certain tools, but those tools are only going to make a lot of sense if you can practice them, right? If you can use them, in your lives. It's kind of like taking a language course, right? You learn some Spanish words, you learn some grammar, and so on. And great, you might be able to practice that for a bit and do well in the course. But if you don't use it at all, it seems to get kind of rusty, right? And so the same thing is the case with reasoning. And so it's an area in our lives that we can develop, we can get better at, and we can continue to practice throughout our lives. And the texts that I picked for the course, right, are sort of intended for that. They're texts that are not particularly expensive, not particularly difficult. They're things that you can keep on your shelf. I mean, I'm not saying you need to keep them, but there's something that you can keep after this course is over, and refer to them later on. And I think that's something that is important. So, moving to slide 13, critical thinking. So, what is this critical part, right? What does it mean to be critical? And I think it's just, right, this area of our rational minds that we can develop and become better at. We can recognize our various tools that we can develop more. Okay. So that's what we're going to be looking at here. And so again, it's a skill that we can develop, and I believe we ought to develop. So just briefly, I want to sort of look at, this is slide 15, look at some areas where these things, where this sort of this thing that we call critical thinking now, where it did develop. So first of all, I already mentioned sort of the trio of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and they began questioning our basic assumptions, right? And so that we can be rational, right? We don't have to be sort of pulled down by sort of non-rational or irrational elements in society. But they were very skeptical of democracy because they believed that it made it more difficult to develop reasoning and properly sort of order, the human, what they saw as the human soul. And so they really tried to develop these tools of reasoning, and mostly what we'll talk about in terms of deductive reasoning. Second is the development of natural sciences, right? And the ability to look at evidence, a critical eye, and develop methods. Now, Aristotle started this project, but it really didn't get underway in the way that we look at it now until modern thought. And so as modern thought, the Renaissance and modern thought developed, we began to see some very, very important tools in the natural sciences. And the notions of causation, notions of induction became much more thoroughly developed, and statistics became an important area of study, and so we see that showing up there. And then finally, the social sciences, right? So not just sort of studying, right, the patterns of human behavior and thought, but then also sort of seeing where various parts of our lives that run counter to reason, right? We would think, oh, we're rational beings, we're all going to act in a certain sort of way. Well, that's not always the case. And so the social sciences began to look at the various sort of elements of our behavior, right? How those things get developed and how they influence who we are, right? The social, the cultural, the personal, with the development of sociology, psychology, anthropology, economics, right? All of these became important disciplines. So that's all I got with for this lecture. So again, welcome to Critical Thinking. I hope that you get a lot out of this course, or at least something, some sort of tool that you can take with you. Right? That's what I'm most concerned with, is having some tools, and maybe, right, maybe you'll get the bug of philosophy just a little bit. So next time we'll do an introduction to logic, and so we'll get a sense of what the logical mind, the thinking mind, is all about. So again, thanks for listening, and we'll see you tomorrow.